We're now going to look at a really important and useful aspect of highlights, and that's guiding learners' browsing. And in this video, they're going to provide a really great overview of a focus session and a filter session. I wanted to use Hapara's video here because they do an excellent job. Although it's a little bit longer, it's well worth the time. So enjoy this video.
Welcome to How to Hapara Highlights, Guide Browsing, Focus, and Filter Sessions. Hebe the Sheepicord is ecstatic that you're here because he really digs guide browsing. He especially loves guide browsing sessions about rainbows and marshmallows. In this video, you will learn how to access the guide browsing feature in Highlights, how to set up a focus guide browsing session and what it's useful for, how to set up a filter guide browsing session and what it's useful for, and ideas and strategies for using the guide browsing feature in your classroom. Teaching is like a giant balancing act. There are a million and one things going on in the classroom at any given time, and teachers have the very important task of making sure everything comes together so that kids learn what they're supposed to. It can sometimes feel like trying to cook a complex Food Network recipe, running around the kitchen like a crazy person, adding a dash of this, an ounce of that, all while making sure one ingredient isn't left on the back burner to set off the smoke detector. In short, teaching is not easy, but you know that. Guide browsing is one tool that Hapara created to make the load a little lighter and help online lessons come together more easily. Guide browsing is a highlights feature that allows you to curate the online learning experience for your learners, as well as keep them on task. You can limit learners' browsing access to just a few specific sites, or give them more browsing freedom, but keep them from visiting few particular sites. You have a variety of options to define parameters for each guide browsing session, which we'll talk about in a moment. Guide browsing is beneficial to learners because it helps their teachers create unique, engaging online lessons that are tailored to meet learners' individual needs and interests. Let's take a look at how guide browsing works so you can see some of those great lessons in action. First, to access this feature, open up Hapara Highlights and click on the blue Guide Browsing button on the top right-hand side of your Highlights page. A box will pop up with two options: set up a focus session or set up a filter session. A focus session allows learners to access only a few specific websites. A filter session prevents learners from accessing a few specific websites. Focus sessions are great when you want to keep learners on a specific page or group of pages. For example, only allowing them to open a quiz you created with Google Forms. Or allow learners to browse a specific website or group of websites. For example, allowing them to browse only the National Geographic website so they can decide on a research topic for a science project. If you choose to set up a focus session, you'll be able to enter up to 10 website addresses to share with learners. These will be the only sites that learners can access during the browsing session. You can also click on Recent tabs to see a list of your recently used links. Highlight stores the 20 most recently used links for 7 days, so it's easy to pick from websites that you use with learners often. Specify if they can visit the whole website, like all of nationalgeographic.com, or only a specific page on a website, like this one on National Geographic site. Establish how long the session will last. It can be as few as 5 minutes or up to 180 minutes. Just be sure the session doesn't extend beyond your class time because it could interfere with other teacher sessions if there is an overlap. Determine what happens when the session ends. Will the tab stay open? Will learners' original tabs be restored? Perhaps you want learners to be able to refer back to that page, so you leave it open. Or maybe you're totally done and moving on to something new, so you close that tab when the session ends. Make the session for the whole class, specific learners, or groups. This is great for differentiation and individualized learning. Schedule the session for later by choosing the date and time that you want the guide browsing session to begin. Plan out your week or even a month's worth of guide browsing sessions. Save your session as a template or use a template you've already created. This is a great way to save time and make use of sessions that have already worked well for your learners. Filter sessions are great for when learners are working on something more open-ended, where they need to exercise good digital citizenship, but aren't quite ready to make 100% of the choices about the content that they consume online. If you decide to set up a filter session, you'll be able to enter up to 5 websites that learners are not allowed to access during the browsing session. Use the Recent Tabs option to select from a list of your recently used links. Establish how long the session will last, from 5 to 180 minutes. Just remember, this shouldn't be longer than your actual class time. Make the session for the whole class, specific learners, or groups. Schedule the session for later by choosing the date and time that you want the guide browsing session to begin. Save your session as a template or use a template you've already created. This is really helpful if you have a list of websites that you know tend to be distracting for learners. Instead of filling out the filter guide browsing form every time, you can just use a template. So now that you know how guide browsing works, Hebe wants to show you a few examples of what this looks like in the classroom. Test and quizzes with Google Forms. If you're new to Google Forms, they are great for summative and formative assessments or even class surveys. Google has a great tutorial on how to create and use forms in your classroom. You can check it out by clicking on the link in the resources section of this lesson. If you want to give an assessment online using a Google form, you probably don't want learners to be able to navigate away from that page. For this scenario, you would want to set up a guide browsing focus session. To do this, click Guide Browsing, then select Set up a focus session. Enter the link to your form. For Where can students go within the link, select Only the page. Next, determine how long learners will have to take the quiz. Let's say 30 minutes. The next option on the form is Keep all tabs introduced in this session open. Toggle that one to No since this is a timed quiz, and you don't want learners to stay on that page after the time is up. For Restore Students' Original Tabs, you might want to toggle to Yes if you want learners to go back to what they were working on after the quiz. Or, if you're starting something new, leave it on No. Next, you'll determine the audience for this session. You could choose the class to give everyone the same quiz, or if you have learners grouped by ability, you can give differentiated quizzes by selecting the group option and choosing the group that will be taking this version of the quiz. Maybe you have a different quiz for every learner. For this option, you would select Student and select the learner who will be taking this version of the quiz. Finally, you can schedule this session for later by toggling to Yes and selecting the date and time that you want the quiz to take place. Click Schedule Session to save. Teaching digital citizenship through gradual release. Maybe your learners aren't ready to be released into the wilds of the internet just yet, but you want them to do online research in a safe environment. To achieve this objective, you could set up a focus session where they are allowed to browse an entire website that you specify. As the year progresses, you can widen the net to include more and more online content if learners continue to demonstrate responsible digital citizenship. For example, if your class is studying the Civil War, you might start them out using one specific website, such as battlefields.org. Then you might decide to open things up to give learners a little more freedom. You might add websites or parts of websites, such as Civil War pages from the Library of Congress or the National Archives websites. As you see learners using the internet responsibly within your parameters, you can continue gradually reducing those parameters and giving learners more freedom. Blended learning. In our next example, we'll see how guide browsing helps to blend whole group instruction with digital tools. In a U.S. history class, a teacher is leading a class discussion on the misconceptions that people have about the Battle of Bunker Hill and why. To best illustrate these general misconceptions, the teacher uses a map from battlefields.org. The teacher wants learners to be able to access the map and only that site for the duration of the discussion so that learners can make inferences about why people have misconceptions about the Battle of Bunker Hill. To facilitate this, the teacher opens a focus guide browsing session for the link. The objective is to keep learners only on this page throughout the class discussion. For Where can students go within the links, the teacher should select Only the page. It will also be important to define the length of this session so that it will coincide with the time allocated for the class discussion, let's say 15 minutes. The teacher wants to be able to continue exploring information on Bunker Hill on the rest of the battlefields.org website after the discussion is over, so he toggles to Yes for Keep all tabs introduced in this session open. Since this is a whole group activity, he selects the class next to Who is this session for? Once the class discussion and the focus guide browsing session have ended, it might be a good time to start a filter guide browsing session while learners explore independently and block other problem sites that might not already be blocked by the school firewall, like this one. You can set up a filter session by clicking on the blue Guide Browsing button and selecting Set up a filter session. Enter the problem website's address in the pop-up form. Make sure to define the time period so that it lasts the entire time that learners are working on this activity. Next to Who is this lesson for? You have some options depending on how digitally responsible your learners are. You may want to set up this filter session for the whole class if it is early in the year or later in the year, only for certain students who tend to get distracted with cat videos and the like. Weeding out bad online sources. Finally, there will sometimes be situations when you don't have any specific links for a lesson, but you definitely want learners to stay off of certain sites. Perhaps you're asking learners to post to a class discussion board or blog. Learners might need to do research online to inform their posts and comments, so they'll need access to a variety of sources that can't necessarily be predetermined. For example, if the discussion board is about topics on the Civil War, you might want them to stay off of sites like Quora, Reddit, or Medium, as they contain opinions and not necessarily historical research. If students aren't yet able to differentiate good from bad online resources, you would want to keep them off of sites like these. You can set this up by creating a filter guide browsing session. Just enter the website address that you want to keep learners away from and then fill in the rest of the form to define the exact parameters of your session. Hit the blue button at the bottom and boom. Well, it's time for Heapy the Sheepycorn to go on to his next marshmallow hunt, so we've got to say bye for now. We hope you enjoyed learning about how to access the guide browsing features and highlights, how to set up a focus guide browsing session and what it's useful for, how to set up a filter guide browsing session and what it's useful for, and ideas and strategies for using the guide browsing feature in your classroom. If you have questions, check out the Hapara community. To learn more about getting the most out of Hapara, check out our other videos in the resources section.